Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. March 7th, 1945. The hills above Remagen, Germany. Imagine you're there. The air hangs heavy with the damp haze of early spring, the wind biting just enough to remind you that winter hasn't fully released its grip. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman lifts his field binoculars, his fingers trembling, not from fear but from sheer stunned disbelief. He blinks once, then again. Could it be? There it is, still standing. A bridge, not just any bridge, the last bridge, the only bridge. For 6 relentless months, Allied strategists had calculated, guessed, and braced for the inevitable. Every bridge across the Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier, would be reduced to rubble by the time they arrived. That was doctrine. German commanders from the Rhine to the Elbe had been given crystal clear orders: destroy every crossing before the Allies get there. Yet before Engerman, through the drifting mist, rose the unmistakable silhouette of the Ludendorff Bridge. Twin stone towers stood like ancient sentinels. Steel arches stretched defiantly across 300 meters of fast, frigid water, the mighty Rhine, a river that had, for centuries, stood as Germany's bastion against invasion from the west. At his side, Lieutenant Karl Timmerman let the gravity of the moment slip into words that would echo across history. We have to take it, right now, before they blow it to hell. What neither of them could know, not fully, not yet, was that this moment, this single decision, would ignite a chain reaction of chaos within the German military so total, so absolute, that seasoned officers would later recall it as the instant they realized the war was over. Not with a bang, but with a bridge. This wasn't just a tactical win. This was a psychological landslide, a demolition of Nazi defensive doctrine so profound it would erase decades of militaristic confidence in mere minutes. The equation being rewritten here wasn't one of blood and bullets, but of strategic geometry. The Rhine wasn't merely a river, it was a fortress. 300 meters of icy resistance, currents powerful enough to flip assault craft like matchsticks, waters deep enough to swallow tanks whole. Its banks rose steep and merciless, perfect killing grounds for defenders, a natural moat that had protected central Germany since the time of the Roman legions. Yes, imagine it. Roman soldiers 2,000 years ago, peering across this very same stretch of water into the shadowy woods of Germania, their shields glinting under the same cold sun. The Rhine had always meant one thing: you shall not pass. But now, in March of 1945, Hitler clung to that ancient shield as his last desperate hope. His delusions whispered of a stalled Allied advance, of time bought to negotiate a separate peace with the West, or to shift crumbling divisions from the Eastern Front for a final stand. And yet, one intact bridge, one, threatened to annihilate that fragile strategy in the span of 10 minutes. But the seeds of this disaster had been planted long before Remagen. It began with the blood-soaked snows of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble in the West, had collapsed spectacularly by the end of January 1945. What Nazi propaganda had hailed as a glorious counteroffensive turned out to be a suicidal hemorrhage. The numbers tell the tale: over 100,000 German casualties, 600 tanks destroyed, and perhaps most devastating of all, the loss of veteran panzer divisions, elite units that could never be replaced. The Wehrmacht west of the Rhine was no longer a shield. It was a shadow. By early March, 12 American divisions surged eastward like a steel tide, advancing along a front that stretched from the Netherlands down to Switzerland. Facing them, the German 15th Army, tasked with defending the crucial Rhine sector between Cologne and Koblenz. But it was a ghost force, barely 50,000 combat-effective troops, staring down an enemy 5 times their number. And then there was the bridge itself, the Ludendorff. Its presence was more than strategic. It was symbolic and bitterly ironic. Named after General Erich Ludendorff, the sharp-minded but ultimately unsuccessful architect of German strategy in the First World War, the bridge had been built between 1916 and 1990. But the hands that laid its foundation were not German. They were Russian, prisoners of war, slaves in all but name. And they had done their job too well. Under brutal conditions, those men had forged steel trusses capable of supporting fully loaded military trains. They built something meant to last. And last it did, far beyond what its builders or its masters ever intended. Now, in March 1945, that bridge stood not as a symbol of German might, but as the doorway through which the Allies would march into the very heart of the Reich. Imagine standing before it, a fortress of stone and steel. At each end of the bridge loomed towers of raw power, carved from stone, rising 3 stories high, each level fortified to repel invaders. Below them, sunk deep into the bones of the Rhine, 4 titanic stone piers anchored the structure like claws gripping the riverbed. This wasn't just a bridge, it was a stronghold. But hidden within its very design was its secret death sentence. The original blueprints, drafted during a time when war was already anticipated, called for the bridge's self-destruction. Built into its frame were demolition chambers, hollow cavities meant to hold enough explosive force to send the entire span crashing into the river below at the first sign of enemy advance. That fate never came, at least not then. After Germany's defeat in the First World War, the victorious French, wary of German resurgence, filled those explosive chambers with concrete during their occupation. The bridge, for a time, had been defused, but history is rarely still. In 1936, with the defiant Reich rising once again, Hitler's engineers returned to the bridge. This time, they didn't hide the mechanism for destruction. They flaunted it. 60 zinc-lined boxes were bolted to the bridge's steel girders, each designed to hold precisely 3 kilograms of explosives. The configuration was coldly efficient. 1 command, 1 signal, 1 chain reaction, and the bridge would vanish in seconds. But then came the Mulheim disaster, October 1944. An American bomb fell upon the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne, detonating the very explosives meant for later use. The destruction was instantaneous, but it was premature, a mistake, a misfire, and Hitler erupted. His fury was apocalyptic. The officers responsible were dragged before military courts. New orders followed with the wrath of a dictator betrayed. All demolition charges on bridges spanning the Rhine were to be removed immediately and stored nearby. No exceptions. But there was more, a chilling addendum. Charges could only be reattached when Allied troops were within 8 kilometers, and detonation could only proceed under written authorization from a sector commander. Can you see the trap? German officers now faced a harrowing dilemma. Destroy a bridge too early and risk court-martial for sabotaging their own retreat. Wait too long and face execution for letting the enemy cross. The result? Paralysis. In the moment where speed meant survival, Fear of Hitler's wrath rendered commanders incapable of action. And then came Operation Lumberjack. It sounded modest, almost pedestrian, but the name belied its significance. This American offensive would prove one of the most pivotal maneuvers of the entire war. Its goal? Seize Cologne and Koblenz, two ancient cities, guardians of vital crossings over the Rhine. Leading the charge was the American First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, thrusting eastward through the rugged Eifel region. The German resistance they encountered had lost its cohesion. Gone were the disciplined defenses of earlier campaigns. Now they faced desperate stalling tactics, efforts meant to delay the inevitable, to buy time for troops fleeing east across crumbling bridges. Among the vanguard was a force that had become legend among Allied and Axis alike, the 9th Armored Division, commanded by Major General John Leonard. The Germans had nicknamed it the Phantom Division because no matter how often their intelligence reported it destroyed, it always returned, ghost-like, deadly, unstoppable. The morning of March the 7th dawned under a blanket of fog, thick, silent, shrouding the Rhine Valley like a curtain before the final act. Within the ranks of the Wehrmacht, chaos reigned. The iron discipline of 1940 had long since disintegrated. On March 6th, just a day before, General Edwin von Rothkirch, commander of the 53rd Corps, charged with defending Remagen, took a wrong turn. He was captured after wandering into American lines. His designated replacement, General Richard von Bothmer, never even reached Remagen. The roads were already under American control. At 1:00 a.m. on March 7th, hours before the Americans would appear on the hills, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps was abruptly handed responsibility for the Ludendorff Bridge. One problem: he was 64 kilometers away and had never laid eyes on the bridge. His response was swift, if desperate. He dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, with just 8 men and a radio. The plan: reach the bridge, take command, cobble together a defensive perimeter by commandeering retreating units. What followed was a nightmare. Wrong turns, blocked roads, fuel shortages, American patrols lurking in the fog. It all conspired to unravel the mission. At some point, the radio team became separated. Communication vanished. And Scheller? He didn't arrive in Remagen until 11:15 a.m. By then, the Americans were almost upon them. On the ground in Remagen, the man actually in command was Captain Willy Bratke. But his situation was tragic. His official garrison strength was listed at 600 men. The reality? A mere 36. Many were wounded, others were elderly, some were teenagers conscripted into the Volkssturm, the desperate civilian militia assembled in the Reich's final days. A significant portion were Osttruppen, Soviet prisoners of war who had joined the German army not out of loyalty, but as a means to escape starvation in the camps. Their willingness to die fighting Americans was doubtful. Bratke had pleaded for reinforcements. He had begged for functioning radios. He had written again and again, warning of the vital importance of the Ludendorff Bridge and the ticking clock of its vulnerability. No one had listened, not until it was too late, not until American tanks were at the gates. Chaos does not shout. It whispers, then roars. Captain Willy Bratke's requests for men, for radios, for reinforcements dissolved into the bureaucratic black hole of a German command collapsing under the weight of its own confusion. By the time anyone answered, it was too late. The explosives that should have already been wired into the Ludendorff Bridge's very bones Those 2,800 kilograms of destruction meant to turn it to twisted wreckage were still in crates, collecting dust in a nearby storehouse. It wasn't until March 6th, just one day before the Americans appeared on the ridge, that frantic German engineers were finally ordered to install them. They scrambled through the night, lacing the piers with bulk charges and attaching 300-kilogram-shaped explosives to critical steel joints. But time had run out, and fate, it seemed, had plans of its own. March 7th, early afternoon, the American approach to Remagen carried the quiet weight of destiny disguised as routine. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman, leading a task force from the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B, with units from the 14th Tank Battalion and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, had been given a simple mission: take Remagen, then pivot south to link up with Patton's Third Army. Nothing more, nothing less. No one, absolutely no one, expected to find the bridge intact. All intelligence pointed to the opposite. Aerial photographs, intercepted orders, and reports from Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz painted the same picture. The Germans were destroying every crossing across the Rhine in the face of Allied pressure. The Ludendorff Bridge should have been rubble by now, a memory, but it wasn't. At around 1 p.m., as the lead American tanks crested the forested heights and emerged onto the hills above Remagen, the sight that unfolded before them was so surreal it seemed pulled from a dream. The bridge still stood. German vehicles were still streaming across it, desperate to flee. Civilians clustered at its approaches. The massive steel span reached across the river like a miracle or a trap. The demolition charges were visible, dark shadows clinging to the steel trusses, and then Lieutenant Karl Timmerman stepped forward. Only 22 years old, but already a seasoned platoon leader. Born in Frankfurt in 1922, he had come to America as a child and now returned in the uniform of a liberator. Fluent in German, acutely aware of both the symbolism and the strategy unfolding before him, Timmerman understood. This wasn't just a bridge. It was the failure of the last German hope. A defensive line defeated not through firepower, but by disarray and delay. By the time Brigadier General William Hogue, commander of Combat Command B, arrived on the scene at 2:45 p.m., the decision was already forming like thunder on the horizon. Hogue didn't need a second look. He grasped the scale of the opportunity instantly. This wasn't just a crossing. It was a leap across time itself. A chance to jump the gun on Montgomery's Operation Plunder, a meticulously planned Rhine crossing scheduled for late March. This single moment could put American forces 3 weeks ahead of the entire Allied timetable. His command would define the course of the war and his own career. We're taking that bridge now. But on the far side of the river, the German defenders were spiraling into their worst nightmare. Major Hans Scheller had arrived at the bridge just over 2 hours earlier, battered by exhaustion and disbelief after his hellish journey through enemy-held roads. Captain Bratke gave him a rapid-fire briefing. Yes, the charges were finally in place. Yes, the detonators were wired and linked to an electric trigger in the eastern tunnel entrance. A backup system, a manual fuse, had also been installed. But that was where the good news ended. The defensive perimeter was a fantasy. The units Scheller had planned to rally were either already across the river or bypassing Remagen entirely. The fog that had provided cover all morning, it had lifted at precisely the worst moment, leaving the entire area exposed to American artillery spotters perched in the hills, and then, like clockwork, at 3:15 p.m., the sound of treads. American tanks appeared at the western edge of town. There would be no more time, no more plans, no more delay. The American assault began with cold precision. The town of Remagen, once a serene Rhine resort, was now a husk of its former self, scarred by years of Allied bombing. Yet even in its ruin, it remained a gateway, and the gateway was about to fall. The assault lasted less than 30 minutes. At its spear point, Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon, commanding the formidable M26 Pershing tanks, the newest titans of American armor. Most German troops had never even seen one before. Armed with 90mm cannons, the Pershings could punch through any German tank. But today, they weren't hunting panzers. They were blowing open the road to the Rhine. Smoke shells burst into white clouds, screening the advance. High explosive rounds hammered German positions, and behind the steel came the boots. Timmerman's infantry sweeping through the ruins, moving from cratered street to collapsed house. The defenders, what few remained, fell back almost immediately. Their resistance wasn't a fight. It was a retreat into history, panic, dust, a heartbeat from destruction. As American tanks rolled into Remagen, German defenders melted into the last available escape route, the bridge. Most didn't resist. They ran. Captain Willy Bratka, watching from the shadow of the western tower, knew this was the final moment. At 3:20 p.m., he issued the command, destroy the western approach ramp. The explosion ripped through stone and soil, carving a crater nearly 3 meters across. Enough to stop tanks, for now, but not the infantry. And critically, the main bridge remained standing, still usable, still intact. Now it was a matter of minutes and meters. American tanks repositioned at the bridgehead. Their 90mm cannons thundered across the Rhine, targeting the Erpler Lay, a basalt cliff rising 180 meters above the eastern bank. Bristling with German anti-aircraft guns, the ridge became a fortress raining down fire. Those flak cannons designed to shoot into the sky were now angled down, spitting death at men instead of planes. And yet, they advanced. At approximately 3:50 p.m., Lieutenant Karl Timmerman's infantry, about 120 men from a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, stepped onto the Ludendorff Bridge. It was not a charge, but a calculated sprint across hell. They moved in bursts, darting from cover to cover, hugging the towers, ducking behind railings, crawling across open space under a storm of lead. German machine guns barked from the eastern towers, from the mouth of the tunnel beyond. Bullets sparked off steel and ricocheted off stone. Several Americans fell immediately, but the rest kept going. Watching from the tunnel entrance, Major Hans Scheller stood at the crossroads of fate. The bridge was primed. The electrical detonation system was in place. The enemy was halfway across. Every manual, every training, every instinct told him what to do. Blow the bridge, now. But then came a voice and a dilemma. Lieutenant Carl Peters, commander of an anti-aircraft battery, ran to him with a desperate plea. His unit had just deployed a top-secret Henschel HS-297 rocket launcher capable of launching 24 high-velocity AA rockets with stunning precision, technology the Allies had never seen. But Peters had a problem. His battery was still on the western side of the bridge. If Scheller detonated now, that weapon and those soldiers would fall into American hands. So he made his choice. He waited. It would cost him everything. Once Peter's battery had crossed, Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the German engineer responsible for the explosives, stood by at the electrical trigger deep inside the tunnel. The order came at roughly 4 p.m. American soldiers were now 2/3 of the way across. Friesenhahn turned the key. Nothing, no roar, no fire, just silence. A shell, perhaps American, perhaps German, had likely severed the wiring. No one ever knew for certain. What mattered was this: the system had failed. And in that moment, history changed. Sergeant Alex Drabick, 34, from Toledo, Ohio, ran forward. His boots hit the eastern bank of the Rhine. He became the first American soldier to cross the river in combat, since Napoleon's troops had marched in the opposite direction over a century before. Behind him came more. Timmerman and the rest of A Company poured through. As bullets flew, Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his men set to work with wire cutters, racing to sever any remaining lines to the demolition charges before the Germans could activate the manual backup. But the Germans had one last card to play. Corporal Anton Faust, a German engineer, volunteered for a suicide mission. He ran exposed, unprotected, across nearly 100 meters of open bridge, flames and lead slicing the air around him. He reached the fuse. He lit it. At approximately 4:15 p.m., an explosion rocked the Ludendorff Bridge. The deck lifted. Smoke and steel filled the sky. American soldiers were thrown to the ground. Screams echoed. For a moment it seemed the Germans had finally succeeded. But as the dust settled, the bridge still stood. Damaged? Yes. The roadbed sagged by 6 inches, but it was passable. The steel arches had held. The race was over. The Americans had won. And then the engineers swarmed in. Training overtook adrenaline. Chaos gave way to coordination. American combat engineers surged across the battered span, racing to disarm remaining charges and reinforce the structure. The cratered western ramp was patched. Sandbags were laid. Tools clanged against steel. On the eastern side, Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion moved swiftly. They fanned out from the tunnel mouth, pushing up the steep slopes of the Erpeler, expanding the foothold on enemy soil. A perimeter was forming. Defense where only moments before there had been only audacity. The unthinkable had become reality. It didn't end with a roar. It ended with surrender. As dusk fell over the Rhine, German resistance crumbled with startling speed. The defenders, who had just hours before fired across the Ludendorff Bridge, were now in full retreat, their will spent. Captain Bratke, unable to mount any further resistance, led the remnants of his force into the shadows of a 400-meter railroad tunnel that pierced the base of the Erpeler. By 5:30 p.m., Lieutenant Karl Timmerman and his men had fought their way to the tunnel entrance. What they found inside was not a last stand, but a mass of weary, dazed soldiers. Hundreds of prisoners, many of whom expressed nothing but quiet relief that it was over. For them, this was not capture, it was rescue. Major Hans Scheller, however, made a decision rooted not in relief, but in despair. He knew the bridge, his bridge, was lost, and with it, his future. Formal responsibility for its defense lay with him. In a moment of tragic resolve, he commandeered a bicycle and pedaled east, hoping to reach Corps headquarters and explain somehow what had happened. He never got the chance. 4 days later, Scheller was arrested. He was swiftly court-martialed and executed by firing squad. A scapegoat, sacrificed to a failure that had dozens of fathers, none of whom would face a bullet. Meanwhile, across the river, electricity wasn't just running through wires, it was running through command lines. At around 5 p.m., Brigadier General William Hoge picked up his field radio and relayed a message that would ripple through every echelon of the Allied command structure. "We got the bridge." The message reached Major General John Leonard, Hoge's division commander, who wasted no time. He passed it to 1st Army Headquarters, where Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was in conference with his staff. Eyewitnesses recall Hodges lunging for the telephone, knocking over his coffee in the process. He didn't care. Within minutes, he was on the line to the man who commanded the entire 12th Army Group, General Omar Bradley. Bradley, in a separate meeting with Major General Harold Bull, was interrupted by an aide. The call was urgent. The voice on the line was electrified. "Brad, we've got a bridge," said Hodges, barely able to contain himself. "A bridge?" Bradley stood up. "You mean you've got one intact on the Rhine?" "Yep. Leonard nabbed one at Remagen before they could blow it up." Bradley's reply became legend. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust him wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" "Just as fast as we can push it over," came the reply. Bradley didn't hesitate. He grabbed another line and placed a call to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, at his headquarters in Reims, France. Eisenhower understood immediately. This wasn't just a battlefield success. It was a rupture in the entire German defense doctrine. He would later call it one of those rare and fleeting moments in war where a single stroke, if seized, could alter the entire course of the conflict. Originally, Eisenhower's plan had called for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to make the main crossing of the Rhine at Wesel in late March. That operation, Operation Plunder, had been choreographed with surgical precision, airborne drops, vast artillery barrages, deliberate buildup. The Americans were supposed to play a supporting role, smaller, measured. But now, the Remagen Bridge rewrote the script. Eisenhower issued immediate orders: exploit the bridgehead, flood it. Every available unit was to divert south to Remagen. In mere hours, the strategic spotlight of the entire Western Front pivoted. What had been a side operation became the spear point. Back in Germany, Hitler's world unraveled. News of the bridge's capture hit Adolf Hitler's headquarters in Berlin like a bomb of its own. His reaction was a toxic blend of cold, strategic dread and volcanic, murderous rage. For weeks, Hitler had clung to a fantasy that the Rhine would buy him time. Time to reshuffle, to beg for a separate peace with the Western Allies, to stave off collapse in the East. The river had been his last bulwark. Now that fantasy was demolished by an intact Allied bridgehead, one that shouldn't have existed and yet did. And Hitler did what he always did when faced with disaster. He looked for someone to kill. He summoned General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, a loyal Nazi and a man with a reputation for brutal efficiency, from the Eastern Front. Hübner was handed an obscene task: create a flying special court-martial. Its mission? Not justice, executions. The court was a cruel masquerade, a mobile execution squad in uniform. Hübner traveled with 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 military policemen who doubled as his firing squad. None of them had any legal training. That didn't matter. When offered a copy of the German Military Code of Justice, Hübner waved it off with chilling finality. "The only authority I need is the Führer's order." The purge began. On March the 10th, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, was dismissed. A career soldier, an aristocrat, a man who had long questioned Hitler's judgment, he was cast out to satisfy the dictator's paranoia. He was replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, airlifted in haste from his command in Italy. A skilled tactician, yes, but in that moment, what Hitler needed most was someone loyal, not necessarily someone wise. The reckoning had begun. But it would not save Germany. The bridge at Remagen had done more than connect two banks of the Rhine. It had broken the back of Hitler's western defenses. They called him Hitler's firefighter. But even he couldn't extinguish this blaze. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was no stranger to crisis. A master of defensive warfare, he'd earned his reputation patching holes in fronts that were collapsing under Allied pressure. But when he assumed command in the West after the dismissal of Field Marshal von Rundstedt, even Kesselring recognized the truth. Remagen was lost. Later, with bitter clarity, he would refer to it as the crime of Remagen. The capture of the bridge, he said, shattered the Rhine front, making any notion of prolonged defense impossible. Others were even more direct. Hermann Göring, overseeing the dying embers of the Luftwaffe, did not mince words. The capture of the bridge made a long defense impossible. But it was more than just strategy. This was psychological collapse. For German officers who still clung to the fading hope that the Rhine could be held, that a final line of defense might be forged, the sight of American tanks rolling across the river destroyed that illusion. They now understood the war was entering its final fatal chapter. The flying court-martial struck like a blade in the dark. Its mission was not justice, it was retribution. On March 9th, the tribunal reached its first high-profile target, General Major Richard von Bothmer, who had nominal command of the Bonn-Remagen sector, but had never even reached the bridge. He was tried and convicted in swift order, dereliction of duty. The sentence, demotion to private and 5 years in prison. But for von Bothmer, there was no future left to endure. His wife was dead. His son had fallen in battle. On March 10th, in the courtroom itself, he grabbed a pistol from a court official and shot himself. The tribunal pressed on, cold and unrelenting. By March 11th, the court had reached Army Group B headquarters, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model. 4 officers were tried that day in proceedings that each lasted less than an hour, speed taking precedence over truth. Major Hans Scheller was charged with failure to detonate the bridge, despite arriving only 2 hours before the attack and doing everything humanly possible under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Carl Peters, who had pleaded with Scheller to delay detonation in order to evacuate his top-secret rocket launcher battery, was convicted for allowing it to fall into enemy hands. Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Strobel, both combat engineers who had laid the charges days earlier but were 60 kilometers away at the time of the attack, were found guilty of insufficient preparation. All 4 were sentenced to death. On March 14th, in the dense forests near the villages of Rimbach and Oberirsen, they were led into the woods, forced to kneel, and shot in the back of the neck. Their bodies were buried in unmarked, shallow graves. No honors, no gravestones, no names. But the tribunal wasn't finished. Captain Willy Bratke, the very officer who had done more than anyone to prepare the bridge's demolition, was tried in absentia and sentenced to death. But Bratke was already an American prisoner, captured in the railroad tunnel on March the 7th. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer who had personally turned the key on the failed detonator, was also in American custody. He too was tried in absentia, but in a rare flicker of judicial logic, he was acquitted. Field Marshal Model, unmoved, endorsed the executions. He ordered that news of the punishments be circulated throughout the German military. The message was unmistakable. Failure will be punished by death, regardless of circumstance. But while Germany was hunting scapegoats, America was building an empire across the Rhine. The Ludendorff Bridge still stood, battered, damaged, sagging, but defiant. Combat engineers worked around the clock. They bolted new supports onto weakened joints, patched the cratered western approach, and installed lighting for nighttime traffic. Military police established order, routing columns of soldiers, jeeps, tanks, and artillery onto the span. Within 24 hours, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed into the eastern bank bridgehead. Infantry battalions, tank companies, artillery batteries, steel, firepower, momentum, all flowing east. But no one was under the illusion that the bridge would last forever. It had been pushed beyond its limits, and collapse was a constant threat. So American engineers moved fast. Redundancy was the new strategy. By March 9th, just 48 hours after the initial crossing, the first tactical bridge was completed, an M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge built just north of the Ludendorff. Light, flexible, modular, it became the artery through which the war surged forward. Simultaneously, work began on a second pontoon bridge, another lifeline to ensure the advance could not be undone. The new plan was clear. Make the bridgehead permanent. Make it irreversible. No matter what happened to the original span, the path into Germany would remain open. The Rhine had been breached, but the war was not yet won. Hitler's reaction was immediate, furious, and tragically predictable. His command to erase the Remagen bridgehead summoned every ounce of strength the German military could still scrape together in March 1945. But strength, by this point, was a patchwork of ruin. What arrived wasn't a coherent army. It was a scattershot collection of ad hoc battle groups, cobbled together from shattered frontline divisions, retreating rear echelon units, depot guards, signalmen, even clerks. It was not a counteroffensive. It was a scream of defiance made flesh. Yet of all the responses, it was the Luftwaffe that struck first, or what remained of it. Over the next 10 days, American intelligence tracked an astonishing 367 individual German air sorties over the Remagen sector. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force in the skies of Europe, now resembled a cornered animal, bloodied, desperate, and dying. The Americans answered in kind. They transformed the skies over Remagen into a fortress of steel. 5 full anti-aircraft battalions were deployed, creating a wall of guns and firepower, the likes of which the European theater had never seen. Hundreds of barrels pointed skyward, waiting. The result was a series of some of the most ferocious anti-aircraft battles of the entire war. For 10 days, the roar of engines and the thunder of flak echoed endlessly. American gunners would later claim over 100 German planes shot down in that window, an astonishing tally in such a short span. But Germany still had one last card to play: its machines, technology, fast, deadly, and late. Into the fray roared the Arado R-234, the world's first operational jet bomber. Sleek, futuristic, and moving at over 800 kilometers per hour, they screamed in on lightning-fast diving runs. Too fast to catch, too fast to stop. But there was a flaw. They couldn't hit the target. At such speeds, precision was impossible. Bombs whistled down and missed again and again. Then came the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Faster than anything the Allies had in the sky, they cut through clouds like silver bullets, symbols of German innovation at its peak. And yet, innovation couldn't solve scarcity. There simply weren't enough planes, too few pilots, too little fuel. What was left of the Luftwaffe was now a museum of miracles, powerful, beautiful machines with no army to support them. The attacks inflicted wounds. Yes, there were casualties, there was damage. But the Ludendorff Bridge stood. So did the Treadway Bridge, so did the Americans. And then Hitler raised the stakes. He gave the order to use the V-2 rocket, the fearsome ballistic missile that had been raining terror down on London. It would now be turned for the first and only time against a tactical military target. It was a doomed idea from the beginning. The V-2, while technologically astounding, wasn't designed to hit bridges. It flew at over 5,000 kilometers per hour, soared into the edge of space, and crashed back to Earth without warning. No guidance system, no precision. Still, 11 V-2s were launched from sites in the Netherlands, 130 kilometers away. What they hit was not the bridge, but the surrounding area. A handful of American soldiers were killed, along with an unknown number of German civilians in nearby towns. Not one rocket hit the bridge. The Rhine turned into a deadly maze of sabotage. German frogmen, 7 elite naval demolition specialists, were sent downriver, equipped with Italian underwater breathing gear, hoping to reach the bridge undetected and attach charges. But the Americans had a secret of their own: canal defense lights, a classified technology that projected intense beams across the water's surface, revealing the slightest ripple or movement. All 7 frogmen were either captured or killed. Then came explosive-laden boats, floating mines disguised as logs, debris, river flotsam. Every scrap of the Rhine turned into a weapon. Nothing worked. Even the mighty Karlgerät, the 600-millimeter super-heavy siege mortar, one of the largest artillery pieces ever constructed, was dragged to the battlefield. Its massive shells weighed over 2 tons and could demolish entire fortresses. But it was slow, inaccurate, vulnerable. By the time the mortar was in position, the battle had already moved beyond it. The shells that did fire missed. And through it all, the bridge still stood. What began as a frantic campaign of destruction became, ironically, a symbol of German desperation and Allied defiance. With every failed attack, American morale soared. With every V-2 that missed, with every bomb that fell short, with every jet shot from the sky, the men in the bridgehead knew the Wehrmacht was dying, and the Germans knew it too. Many of the soldiers captured in the brutal fighting east of the Rhine didn't resist. They were done. They laid down their arms, looked to the sky, and expressed relief. Their war, at last, was over. They waited for orders that never came, or came too late. For many German soldiers stationed near Remagen, the silence from above was almost worse than the orders themselves. They knew what would be asked of them: counterattack the bridge. And they knew what that meant: suicide. But those orders never arrived. Or when they did, they were too chaotic, too fragmented, too impossible to execute. By the time the Americans had crossed in force, the Rhine had ceased to be a river. It was now a memory, no longer a barrier, but a breached threshold. The strategic math was brutally clear. Every German unit sent to bottle up the Remagen bridgehead was a unit not available to stop the massive Allied crossing operations being prepared to the north under Montgomery or to the south by Patton. The German defensive line, stretched, battered, exhausted, was now being pulled apart from the inside. Major General Karl Wagener, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model, would later summarize the catastrophe in the simplest possible terms. The capture of the bridge signaled the end of the war for Germany. In post-war interrogations, he spoke of guilt, of shame, of a moment when German commanders realized they had lost the initiative completely. The Allies could act. Germany could only react. The failure to destroy the bridge became more than a tactical blunder. It became a symbol of a command system broken beyond repair, of a once vaunted military culture now choking on its own indecision. For German officers schooled in the Prussian tradition of military precision, the loss of the Ludendorff Bridge was not just a military failure, it was a moral collapse, a devastating realization. The Wehrmacht that had stormed across Europe in 1940 had become a ghost. Then on March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the bridge gave way. It happened at approximately 3:00 p.m. The Ludendorff Bridge, battered by war, shaken by artillery, weakened by the failed demolition charges of March 7th, could hold no more. Witnesses reported a terrifying chorus of sounds in the minutes before the fall, rivets snapping like rifle fire, echoing across the river. Then it happened. A vertical hanger on the southern arch snapped, followed by another. The center span groaned, lifted, as if trying to fly, and then plunged into the Rhine with a thunderous roar heard for kilometers. 28 American combat engineers died instantly. More than 60 were wounded. Most were from the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, the very men who had saved the bridge in the first place, who had disarmed explosives under fire, who had labored day and night to repair the damage. Now, cruelly, they paid with their lives for the very structure they had preserved. But the tragedy was not a setback. By the time the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed, its strategic role was already fulfilled. The Americans had prepared for this moment. 2 tactical bridges were already complete, with a third nearing completion. Pontoon bridges, treadways, Bailey bridges, a whole web of steel and rubber now spanned the Rhine. And most importantly, more than 25,000 troops had already crossed the original bridge. What came next was not just a crossing, it was an eruption. In the days that followed, traffic increased. The tactical bridges could handle more weight, faster, smoother. The American momentum surged forward. By March 25th, just 18 days after the first tanks rolled across the Ludendorff Bridge, the numbers were staggering. Over 125,000 American troops had crossed at Remagen 6, full divisions, complete with tanks, artillery, and supply columns. Our bridgehead, 8 miles deep and 25 miles wide, including 11 kilometers of Autobahn, the very lifeline connecting the Ruhr to Frankfurt. And then the breakout began. March 25th, American armored divisions, no longer restrained by the narrow perimeter of the bridgehead, unleashed their full fury. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division covered 108 kilometers in a single day. Combat Command A roared 110 kilometers forward in just 11 hours. The German front didn't bend, it shattered. Resistance that had once been fierce around the bridge vanished in the open plains beyond. Entire German units surrendered rather than be obliterated. On March 29th, Combat Command A took over 1,200 prisoners in a single action. The American advance was so fast, so overwhelming, that German commanders lost contact with their own forces. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Model, had begun the month with 325,000 men. Now it was disintegrating before his eyes. Divisions lost contact with Corps. Corps lost contact with Army headquarters. The command system, the very spinal cord of the German war machine, collapsed. The bridge at Remagen had not just carried soldiers across a river, it had broken the back of the Reich. What had started with a moment of disbelief, a single bridge still standing, ended with the total collapse of German defense in the West. And the world would remember it not as a single battle, but as a moment when history itself cracked open and the tide of war flooded through. The bridge was gone, but the consequences were just beginning. The strategic shock waves from Remagen didn't stop at the Rhine's edge. They rippled through the entire German war machine, twisting its structure until it cracked. At the center of the storm stood Field Marshal Walter Model, trapped in a web of impossible decisions. He now commanded an army group that was expected to do the unthinkable: defend against the expanding Remagen bridgehead, contain American breakout forces pouring across other Rhine crossings, and somehow protect the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart. He could not do all three. He couldn't even do one. The Ruhr, the blackened, smoking engine of the German war effort, produced 80% of Germany's coal and steel. It forged tanks, fueled trains, fed the war. If the Ruhr was lost, the war was over. Model understood this with terrifying clarity. Without coal, there could be no steel. Without steel, there could be no shells, no tanks, no rifles. Without the Ruhr, the Wehrmacht would die of starvation, and the road to the Ruhr had been opened by a bridge. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had created the conditions for the collapse of the Ruhr, and once the Ruhr fell, there would be nothing left. By March 31st, the impossible had become reality. 3 weeks after that astonishing moment when American troops charged across the Ludendorff Bridge, all 4 American armies on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine. The crossing that Allied planners had expected to be the bloodiest of the war, one that would demand complex amphibious operations, tens of thousands of casualties, and weeks of brutal fighting, had been completed in days. The Rhine, which had repelled Roman legions and stood for 2,000 years as a barrier to Germany's heart, had been breached at multiple points in less than a month. General Dwight D. Eisenhower captured the gravity of the moment in his memoirs. "We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge. The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany was pierced. The final defeat of the enemy was suddenly now in our minds, just around the corner. And he wasn't alone in that belief. War correspondents spoke of a war now shortened by months. Even British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose carefully planned Operation Plunder had been eclipsed by the audacity of Remagen, acknowledged its strategic weight. From the east, Soviet generals watching the Western Allies race toward Berlin accelerated their own offensives, desperate to beat the Americans to the German capital. The final race for Germany had begun. And the starting gun had fired at Remagen. How much time did the bridge save? That question haunted both sides. German officers gave varying estimates. Weeks, some said. Months, said others. But the truth was, the math no longer mattered. The impact was systemic, not sequential. The bridge didn't just accelerate the Allied timeline. It obliterated German strategic options. Before Remagen, German planners imagined holding the Rhine into April or May, buying time to harden Berlin's defenses, perhaps even negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies, isolating the Soviets. After Remagen, those dreams dissolved into fantasy. The Rhine fell 3 weeks ahead of schedule. German reserves, which might have halted Montgomery's assault at Wesel, were already bled dry in futile counterattacks around Remagen. And morale? Devastated. The psychological collapse was as real as the tactical one. Soldiers who once believed they were defending Germany now realized they were prolonging a defeat. The fight became emptier by the hour. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the 3rd Corps engineer who oversaw the defense and exploitation of the bridge, later estimated the price tag of Remagen in reverse. The intact bridge, he said, saved 2 months of fighting and as many as 35,000 casualties. His calculation wasn't guesswork. It was comparison. At Wesel, where Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, the Allies brought everything: Wahadas on 200 artillery pieces, airborne assaults, amphibious landings, and still they paid in blood. At Remagen, the Americans had crossed the Rhine without boats, without beachheads, without the killing fields of open water. The bridge had given them a direct, dry, defendable path into Germany. That bridge, now at the bottom of the river, had already won the war. Not alone, not without sacrifice, but as a symbol, as a strategic pivot, as the crack in Germany's armor that split the front wide open. Remagen had changed everything. When the dust settled and the guns fell silent, the bridge at Remagen still cast a shadow, not just over the Rhine, but over history itself. Historian Ken Heckler, who conducted exhaustive interviews with participants from both sides after the war, reached a conclusion echoed across decades of scholarship. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the end of the war. Some historians would later estimate that Remagen shortened the war by as much as 6 months. Others offered more conservative assessments, weeks perhaps. But the exact number was never the point. The consensus was absolute. Remagen was a turning point. And like all turning points, it came at a cost. The human toll of the bridge's capture and defense provides its own brutal calculus. From March 7 to March 25, in the intense fighting for the bridge and its surrounding bridgehead, the United States suffered approximately 860 killed, nearly 5,700 wounded, and roughly the same number reported missing. German casualties were even more staggering. Over 11,700 prisoners taken in just those 18 days. Killed and wounded figures were never precisely tallied, but estimates suggest at least another 10,000. The disparity told the deeper truth. The Americans held the skies, commanded the artillery, deployed the tanks, and carried the psychological weight of a war nearly won. The Germans, in contrast, had orders they couldn't fulfill, weapons they couldn't fuel, and the cold certainty that the end was coming fast. But the darkest legacy of the bridge was not the fighting. It was the executions, the trials, the firing squads, the silence after the shots. Major Hans Scheller, just 31 years old, had served with distinction on both Eastern and Western fronts. He had a wife, children, a future. His so-called crime? Arriving at the Ludendorff Bridge 2 hours before the Americans, and failing to hold it with 36 exhausted men against thousands, supported by tanks and artillery. He was executed. Lieutenant Carl Peters, a technical officer, had tried to evacuate a top-secret rocket launcher. His actions were by the book. Preserving advanced technology was standard doctrine. It didn't matter. He was executed. Majors August Kraft and Herbert Strobel, engineers who had followed every protocol in preparing the demolition charges, who weren't even present at the time of the capture, were found guilty of failure. They were executed. None of these men had committed crimes. They were sacrificed to cover for a military system that had collapsed from the top. After the war, justice, delayed and diluted, flickered to life. General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, the Nazi loyalist who had led the flying court-martial, was tried in German courts. For his role in these judicial murders, he received a 4-year prison sentence, a modest punishment, many believed, for so grave a crime. Still, it was a recognition that even at the darkest hour of the Reich, some understood. These trials were a mockery of military justice. Strategically, Remagen settled an argument before it could be had. In the weeks before the crossing, there had been real debate among Western planners. Should the Allies halt at the Rhine, let the Soviets press in from the east, save Allied lives by allowing the Red Army to do the heavy lifting? Remagen made that entire conversation irrelevant. With American forces already across, already building bridges, already expanding the front, any talk of waiting was nonsense. The momentum had to be maintained, and it was. In just 5 weeks, Allied forces advanced from the Rhine to the Elbe River. On April 25th, they met the Soviets at Torgau, cutting Germany in half. By May 8th, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The bridge had helped to close the war. Its reverberations reached far beyond the battlefield. In the United States, news of the bridge's capture spread like wildfire. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, rules against applause were suspended as senators stood and cheered. Newspapers screamed the headlines, "The Rhine is crossed." Victory in sight. War bond sales surged. Public morale, wearied by years of sacrifice, was reborn. Americans could feel it. The end was near. In Germany, the mood was the opposite. For years, propaganda had claimed the Rhine would never fall, that the Allies would break themselves trying to cross it, that the fatherland would be shielded by ancient rivers and modern steel. And yet, the truth was undeniable. A single bridge had remained standing. The Americans had crossed it, and the regime had no explanation. The myth of Nazi invincibility, already crumbling, now lay in ruins. The bridge itself tells the final chapter. It was never rebuilt. The twisted steel, the shattered stone, all of it was cleared from the river, but the towers on both banks were left standing. Silent sentinels, witnesses to history, markers of the moment the tide turned and the war finally began to end. In time, the towers became silent, but not forgotten. The war ended. The bridge was never rebuilt. But the western towers, once darkened by gunfire and command posts, found a new purpose. They were transformed into the Friedensmuseum Brücke von Remagen, the Peace Museum of the Remagen Bridge. Inside its stone walls, the echoes of March 1945 are preserved with solemn clarity. The exhibits trace the structure's history, from its construction by POW labor during the First World War to the catastrophic week that made it immortal. Visitors walk through its halls and confront not only the facts of the battle, but the human weight of its consequences. On the eastern bank, the towers of Erpel, once the mouth of tunnels filled with explosives and commands shouted through gunfire, now host performances of art and music. It is not accidental. The contrast is deliberate, a reminder etched in architecture. From destruction can come creation. And the men who risked everything to seize that bridge were not forgotten either. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American award for valor. So did Sergeant Alex Drabick, the first man to set foot on the Eastern Bank. Dozens of others, infantrymen, engineers, tankers, from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion, earned Silver Stars and Bronze Stars for heroism. Brigadier General William Hoge, who made the decision to take the bridge, was promoted and given command of a corps. And the entire 9th Armored Division, the Phantom Division that had once baffled German intelligence, received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that can be given to a military unit. These awards honored individual and collective courage, but even they could not fully grasp the magnitude of what had been done. Because the men who crossed the bridge at Remagen had not merely seized a tactical objective, they had changed the course of the war. Every day the war was shortened meant thousands of lives saved, American, British, Soviet, German, civilian, prisoner. The men who fought at Remagen didn't just secure a riverbank. They helped bring the war to an end. And then there is the question that haunts all of history. What if? What if the fog hadn't lifted when it did? Would American scouts have ever spotted the bridge in time? What if the electrical detonator had worked? Would hundreds of Americans have died in a fireball and the crossing attempt delayed by weeks? What if Major Hans Scheller had arrived just 2 hours earlier? Could he have rallied enough men to hold the town, to destroy the bridge before the Americans arrived? What if Hitler hadn't ordered the explosives removed after the Cologne incident? Would the charges have been correctly installed and triggered? Each question spirals into a different version of history, one in which the bridge is destroyed, the crossing is delayed, and the war follows its original timetable. But history, like the men who fought it, doesn't deal in certainty. It is made of decisions, mistakes, moments, many of them so fragile they seem accidental. Remagen was one such moment, a collision of bold leadership, human courage, enemy missteps, broken wires, fog lifting, and sheer heart-pounding chance. A reminder that history is not deterministic, that a single hour, a single spark, a single bridge can change the world. In the end, it always comes back to the people, not the steel, not the artillery, not the grand strategy maps. It was Lieutenant Karl Timmerman leading men across a bridge that might explode beneath their feet. It was Sergeant Alex Drabick sprinting across the last stretch of steel while machine guns spat fire at him from the eastern cliffs. It was engineers, gunners, medics, and privates hurling themselves forward under skies filled with smoke, each of them gambling their lives not just for the crossing, but for what it meant: victory, peace, home. It wasn't just the first man across the bridge. It wasn't just the general who gave the order. It was everyone, the combat engineers working on their hands and knees beneath the threat of sudden annihilation, cutting wires with trembling fingers and steady nerves. The tank crews, positioned along the western bank, their 90mm guns scanning the far shore, firing in arcs of thunder to suppress German defenses. The staff officers, reading battlefield reports in real time, sensing something extraordinary unfolding, and having the clarity and boldness to seize the moment. The commanders, who tore up previous orders and redirected entire divisions, thousands of men, hundreds of machines, to exploit a breakthrough that didn't exist the day before. Each action, each decision, each moment of yes instead of no, shaped what followed. Remove any single link in the chain, and the bridge might have been lost. Delay by minutes, hesitate for 1 hour, and the crossing might have failed. This is what gives the story of Remagen its enduring power. The men who crossed that bridge under fire, who held it, who built around it and defended it, were not pawns in the machinery of history. They were its authors. They acted, and history turned. In March 2025, the world remembered. The 80th anniversary of the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was marked with commemorations both in Remagen and across the United States. Veterans organizations, many of them descended from or honoring the legacy of the 9th Armored Division, gathered to pay tribute. Military units, still bearing lineage from those who fought there, held ceremonies, laid wreaths, and saluted a moment that changed their history. Historical societies and scholars revisited the archives, retold the story, passed it forward. Even the German government took part, not to glorify battle, but to reflect on its cost and on the fragile value of peace hard won. For Americans, it was a celebration of courage, of ordinary men who stepped to an extraordinary moment and triumphed. For Germans, it was more complex, a reminder of defeat, yes, but also of liberation from tyranny. For historians, it was a living lesson, an illustration of how contingency and determinism coexist in warfare. The structural forces of history move slowly, but individuals can still light the fuse. The men of Remagen didn't know what they were doing, not fully. They didn't know that their choices would be studied, written about, filmed. They didn't know that their names would appear in museums, memoirs, and monuments. They were soldiers doing their duty in conditions no one would choose. But because they acted, and because they acted with courage, the outcome of a war, the shape of a continent, and the fate of millions were altered. They didn't know they were making history, but they made it anyway.